Desmond, for that very stimulating presentation. I want to divide my short comments into 4 sections. I want to make a few acknowledgments and awareness comments, and then want to contextualize my remarks a little bit, and then to make some comments, and then finally to make some challenges. I have participated, I realize now, in 6 of these enterprises organized by the Western team led by George Gadnitas, and I must say they have been, in a long career, quite stunning highlights for me. I've come to realize that one of the things I do moderately well is to be an intimate outsider. That sounds a little fuzzy, but what it means is that I seem to be able to exist in groups where I'm not fully a member, but sometimes I can cross-exist between 2 groups and be somewhat useful to both groups. Sometimes not so useful, but that's another issue. And that's been a little bit true here at the Western meetings. It was true when I was a student in the United Kingdom, and it was true when I was a visiting faculty member at MIT for a couple of years in the 80s. And so this meeting is really quite a fantasy for me. You do exist, do you not? Because I innocently emailed George from Australia in February when this conference was announced, saying, "Well done, George, that's terrific. I'm glad to see you're still doing these wonderful things." And then he came back saying, "Well, maybe you'd like to participate." I thought, oh my goodness, I haven't done anything for 5 years. Do you really want a Rip Van Winkle perspective on this? At dinner time, Yasmin sort of reassured me. I've been out of the area for 20 years, but she tells me nothing has happened in 20 years until very recently. So that may or may not be true. But let me go on to, as I say, first of all, thank George for these wonderful sessions. 4 of them have been documented this way. The one at the Fields Institute back in 2003, if you're really interested in Seymour Pappert's ideas, that was when we had Seymour and Alan Kay come to the Fields Institute. And it was quite a special occasion. It's still available, somewhat fuzzy, but still available on video there. I believe as a former professor that the purpose of a professor is to provoke. So I'm going to be a little bit good cop, bad cop here later on in my presentation. So let me move quickly to how I came to sort of have some insights into this particular area. In 1972, which is before most of you were born, I was a graduate student in England, and the Second International Congress of Math Education had quite a strange professor and a group of students from the Massachusetts Institute of Technology come to the University of Exeter and do some wonderful workshops. I met Seymour there, and we had a sporadic contact back and forth for about 8 years. When Mindstorms was published, Yasmin showed it a couple of times. It's this publication here, incredibly popular, incredibly influential for a short period of time in the 1980s. I wrote a review of that, which Seymour apparently liked. And he said to me, "Could you come to MIT sometime?" I thought he meant for the weekend, but then I got an invitation to be a visiting professor of architecture. My goodness, another fantasy comes true. And I found to my surprise, shortly after coming back from a trip to Australia, that I was to run the first doctoral seminar at MIT, and the faculty members included people like Jerome Wiesner, who was the former presidential science advisor in the United States, former president of MIT, the building was named after him, etc. Alan Kay, the creative genius from Atari, and several other firms down in Silicon Valley. It was quite fantastic stuff. That part of things came about not just from the review, but because we had conducted in Ontario a very large-scale 2-year study of what we call computers, children, and classrooms. And it was a 400-page document. We have a number of distinguished deans here on the research side, like Donna. Even back 35 years ago, canny faculty members were using strategies like the following. I would like to get X dollars to do a bit of research. I know that I'm not likely to get all the money I asked for, so I will ask for much more than X dollars. My colleague and I were ambitious. We asked for $400,000. We hoped we would get $40,000 because we would be quite comfortable operating with $40,000. We got $400,000. It was because Seymour was on the review committee and he had liked my review of Mindstorm. So there we are. We had a little problem, but we worked our way out of it. It was a really fascinating piece of work, and people started coming up from Boston saying, "You're doing it." And we'd look at them and say, "Yes. Aren't you doing it too?" And it turned out, well, actually, no, they weren't quite doing it that way. Let me just share with you a couple of examples briefly that I think speak to some of the issues that Yasmin brought to us. One of my favorite pieces of that research was a little girl in grade 3, and many of you would be familiar with our system in Ontario where we have this catch bag called special education, and it covers everybody from kids who are really struggling to kids who are really zooming, right? So this young woman, to me, sort of captured the real essence of the potential of this material because she, over a period of 2 years, stayed in special ed. The interesting thing was she had started at the low end of not doing very well at all to being seen as being gifted because these materials enabled her to express herself. It was classic, beautiful Seymour Papert stuff. The other one came out of a grade 6 classroom. We worked because of hardware shortages and so forth, largely with pairs of students. Almost always they were same sex. We let them choose who they'd work with. On very few occasions we would get mixed gender pairs. I had a brilliant research assistant, an older woman, a mother, kids very comfortable with her. She watches one of these mixed gender pairs at work over a morning. The boy is hopeless. The girl is very, very competent. The boy is flailing away, and the girl is saying nothing. Right? They're about 12. At recess, Barbara takes the girl aside. The young woman is very comfortable with her, and she says, "You know how to do that stuff, don't you?" And the girl looks at her and nods and says, "Yes." "Well, then why don't you step in? Why don't you intervene and contribute? Well, why do you let him carry on like that?" It was one of these 12-year-old gives a 50-year-old sort of a really lady. She said, "He needs to feel he's in control." So those are some of the nuggets that came out of that study. That was influential when I helped to choose the Hennigan School that Yasmin showed us that lovely clip from. I was drawing on some of those insights from there. Enough of that, I think. Comments. I kept thinking of Seymour during Yasmin's whole talk. Many of you will know the tragic circumstances of this brilliant, compassionate, warm, wonderful human being who was in a tragic accident and had suffered severe brain damage, and it's just incredibly sad. But I was thinking Seymour would be very happy to see what's happening, and I think there's actually no greater compliment in some ways. I think almost all of the strengths of the works that we've done in the 80s have been maintained. I'll come to one omission possibly later. The big change is around the sophistication and the access to technology. It's quite staggering. I probably have more computing power on my Fitbit than we had in the machines we were using in those days. The gender work, I think, is very admirable. It's tough sledding, as Yasmin showed at the end of her talk. But Seymour would very much approve of the efforts. We were pretty primitive in our awareness of that, looking back retrospectively. What else did I say here about this? Most of the print materials which existed back in the 1980s seem to me to be still highly appropriate. So in 1986, we had an international conference, and we invited people from all over the world to come. There was one in 1984 as well. That one changed my life. Actually, there was a letter that Seymour used to send out that changed my life earlier, which Seymour got about 20 invitations a week to go and talk, and he really only wanted to go to 1 in 200. So he had a letter he sent out which said, I'd love to come and talk with you, but I'm committed. But I have a list of colleagues here, and they do a great job for you. My name for a while was top of that list, and I got some wonderful invitations. I think some disappointed audiences as well, but nonetheless. My favorite one of those was to go to Cleveland. Who would have thought of Cleveland? To talk to a group of people at NASA, who knew NASA was in Cleveland, on a conference called Fueling the Educational Future. And I think this is my favorite title of all time. I gave a paper called No Fuel Like an Old Fuel, The Importance of Teachers in Educational Reform. And that allowed me to move to the essence of what I thought had to be done here, which was to bring teachers on board in a much more significant way. Let me move now then to queries and challenges. This is part of being an intimate outsider. I speak a bit of the language of the group, but I'm not really a member, and from my perspective there's some issues here, so let me raise them. I think the Hawthorne Effect is much more important than we give it credit for. Remember that the early days of Logo was before the development of the graphical user interface. So a great deal of the attraction for Logo initially was that, boy, you could make computers do something. All right, which was very hard to do with the alternatives. And I think that's still possibly true today. Maybe someone will follow up on that. The learning curve, if it's not the Hawthorne Effect being possibly a little bit too important, the learning curve factor, which Esmond referred to at the end of her talk, is I think, quite substantial. There is a primitive version of watch the corporate sector, which I don't agree with, but I'll raise it with you. You can read it in PC Magazine. John Dvorak, who's one of their classic columnists, he says, beware of kids coding that effort because it's just a ploy by the corporate sector to sell hardware. I happen not to believe that, even if Gates and Zuckerberg are here. I don't think it's that simple. I think there's a more sophisticated version of that argument that we need to think about. The scaling issue, I think, is a big one for me. What do I mean by that? Scratch, as I understand it, and Mitch Resnick was one of my students in the doctoral seminar. I have extreme admiration for him. I would support, without condition, his initial efforts to generate something which could be used in a club context. Okay? What I am picking up, and I'm possibly projecting a little bit too much here from a grandparental perspective. I have an 8-year-old granddaughter. Her parents are exceptionally sophisticated computer users. Okay, her father probably ranks in the top 0.1% in the nation on these things. He programs, parallel computers at one point in his doctoral career. They would not want their child doing coding. Okay, they would not want her doing very much, and they would want the option of pulling her out at any time. So this question of this country has gone to a national curriculum, and this country is still thinking about it. I think that's a huge argument, and I need to say that this is also a family where those children do not watch television for some of the same reasons. The emphasis is on the arts. The emphasis is on nature. Tomorrow night, Father's Day will be celebrated by the daughter going off camping with her father and her friends. This is where they want to have their emphases, and I think we can't just dismiss that, particularly if we are going to move in the direction of mandated curriculum. And if we move in the direction of mandated curriculum, we have all the classic problems of how do you deal with the other 96% of teachers. the ones who don't come to George's workshops, because there were very impressive people there. I don't want to flatter you, but that workshop this morning, you know, those people, that was very, very impressive. And that was the same at MIT, except for a Canadian, it was pretty shocking to be told that we can't do workshops on Saturday because we have to work in the liquor store on Saturday as teachers to make ends meet. You know, that sort of stuff. We fortunately, I think, don't have that here, but the rapidity of technical change, that's a real tough one as well. I watched not just Logo, but after 10 years in the Logo community, I did 2 stints at MIT. I moved rather more over into specialized math software, Geometry Sketchpad, etc. And if you track look at the trajectory of that software, you know, it hits a brick wall. Sometimes the brick wall is around hardware, and sometimes the brick wall is around software. But I think kids in coding probably are going to have to deal with that as well. Last comments. The thing that's missing, I mean, I see part of it coming, but I do know, because I also worked with Seymour in France for a while at the Centre Mondial, the modestly named French project that they worked on before they came back to MIT in Paris. There was an exceptionally strong social justice element to the original Logo movement. I think it was entirely Papert, and he convinced Negroponte, who was the director of the lab, to buy into this. But they really, really worked hard at not just having North American kids or affluent children in other parts of the world to really have a chance. The project, which in some ways, I think, I snoozed through it, but I think I was dimly aware of it, was Negroponte's One Laptop per Child project. And that was really quite amazing for a man of his sophistication and affluence. His brother, by the way, ran the CIA. You know, there's some interesting power connections here, but Nicholas, give him credit, really worked hard to bring the power of information technology to poor children in all parts of the world. I'm not picking that up here. Maybe it's there, maybe I'm missing it, but that's the part I think Seymour would want to see somehow included. I'll finish by saying Yasmin and I are affiliated with institutions. 50 years from now, our main claims to fame may be to fight over which one of us influenced Elon Musk the most. You know who Elon is? All right, so Elon Musk spent 2 years at Queen's, and then he decided he better get into the American world, so he went down to UPenn. And we can both feel good because he had 2 years at Queen's and 2 years at Penn. He was accepted into a PhD program at Stanford. He went for 2 days and decided this was not for him. He went off and to found PayPal and SpaceX and Tesla and to wire the world. This is his next project. And so I think of Musk, is this what we're trying to produce out of connected kids? He'd be a poster boy, obviously. He will be approached for money, undoubtedly. He'll be in the next video, if not this one. But I think I raise his name because coding is hot, and Bloomberg Business Review, this week's issue, has the longest article I have ever seen in a weekly journal. It's on code, and it is 35,000 words, 78 pages of a 112-page magazine. It's quite brilliant. The Economist, a few weeks ago, has its theme on artificial intelligence, the promise and the peril. And I think the peril is huge, and Elon Musk and Stephen Hawking agree with me, and they have lots better reason for thinking it. And I think, you know, how far away are kids in coding from machines running humans? I think we really can't dismiss this issue cavalierly. It's probably related to the social justice one. I'm sorry if I've gone on too long, but it was a very stimulating presentation. It provoked lots of thoughts, and you were very fortunate to have the next 2 days to discuss this with the people at this meeting. And again, thank you very much, Stuart.